Good morning, YouTube Nation. Good morning, more particularly History 2301 Texas History. This is a lecture on the tail end of the Empresarios of Texas, if you might like to say, the forgotten Empresarios of Texas. In addition to that, this is also a portion of a lecture, maybe the entire lecture over the Mexican Federal Republic in the 1820s and 30s. So, this is probably, Saturday morning. I've got my Dickies work shirt on. You can watch this video whenever you want to. We'll see you, as housekeeping, we'll see you on Wednesday when you take this. You've already had the exam. You'll watch this lecture. I've got to do some personal things on Monday. So you'll watch this lecture, and on Wednesday we'll have class. So hopefully everything will be good, and we'll see you on Wednesday face-to-face once again. So last we talked before the exam, I rushed and wrapped up and got done with the Irish Catholic, the Irish immigrants to Texas, all those two real colonies down in South Texas along the coastal bend. Power and Hewitson headquartered and capitaled at Refugio, and the other one being McMullen-McGloin, that ultimately really, far more so than Power and Hewitson, a failed colony that was headquartered just west of today's Corpus Christi at San Patricio de Ibernizia. I've alluded to it. I'm not going to go into deep detail about it, but those two colonies are going to develop a real blood feud. Only as good Irish of that era could do. They got into a real fight. They got into a blood feud over who stole whose settlers and what have you. Long story short is a lot of this remnant of the McMullen-McGloin faction thought that the Power and Hewitson faction had poached settlers to help fulfill their impresario contract and drew them into Power and Hewitson's orbit and brought them to Refugio and points beyond. And so they believed that ultimately helped cause McMullen-McGloin to fail. Well, is that true or not? I think it was really more of the land commissioner issue that we touched on last time, that the land commissioners just never showed up. Either died, never showed up, or the contract ran out. And so ultimately that killed it. Trying to get comfortable. So if there it is. That finally kicked in. I was trying to get my chair to stop moving so I could sit comfortably. So this is kind of a stream of consciences thing. So I hope you don't mind me yakking a little bit off the cuff and off the subject. But anyways, back to McMullen and McGloin. They will go after each other hammer and tong, and sometimes you have Romeo and Juliet situations, and I assume everybody who's watching this, at least you should have, somewhere about 8th grade, had to read that, I think, middling Romeo and Juliet play by Shakespeare. It's a tragedy. It's a horrible thing in my estimation, but we believe in Texas and many other states that you must read Romeo and Juliet or your life will not be complete. And that's sarcasm on my part. There are other better Shakespearean plays I think you could watch or read, but Romeo and Juliet is one of them. And you had the reason I bring that up with regard to McMullen and McGloin, Power and Hewitson in that fight is that as late as the 1980s, you had people who were still spilling blood over the issues that surrounded the settlement of those two impresario contracts in the 1820s and 30s. People still getting killed over it. My former office partner was at a funeral where he said everybody, including 75-year-old grandmothers, so to speak, were packing heat and had their 45s and had their 357 revolvers and all sorts of fun stuff like that ready to go just in a nick of moment at a funeral where there was literally a body in the casket, and they were still arguing over the things of the past, and someone, in fact, did get killed. It was back some days before. So anyways, that's Power and Hewitson, that's McMullen and McGloin, but there are other impresario contracts and activities out there. Give you two or three others before we move on to the Mexican political situation of the 1820s. One of them's out in East Texas, and this is where I really wish I had a map that I could just point to and draw and do all what have you. I had put that on your review sheet, but I decided not to use it just simply because we never got to it in class. But it is the impresario contract in Deep East Texas called, it's by Joseph Valine, who's a German, Lorenzo de Zavala, who's a Mexican, and David G. Burnett, who is an American. So you have three different people who are trying to set up their own little colonial empires in Deep East Texas. Well, for those of you who've traveled in East Texas, say to the Henderson area, to Tyler, to Longview, to Liberty, maybe Jasper or something like that. And if you think about that and think about what the flora and the fauna is, what the geography is like in that part of East Texas, well, you'll kind of understand a little bit why things didn't go well for these colonists, or rather these colonies. Well, most of the Anglos who are going to come to Texas are interested in farming. Some ranching, that's out of the old Spanish tradition, obviously, and the Anglos just adapt it and modify it to their own needs and what have you. But many of the Anglo settlers are interested in farming to one degree or another, whether it's cotton, sugar, rice, or corn, or just staples or whatever. But that's what they do. They mostly are farmers. Well, if you think about it, if you wanted to farm land and you had to plow it by a team of mules, and you had to get that grub out and root out all that virgin territory, it'll be a heck of a lot easier to do it along the banks of the Brazos River or the Colorado River, which is essentially a flat bottomland, or even if it's not the flat bottomland, it's got prairies in it that are easier to plow than in East Texas, where you have all those blasted pine trees that have nothing underneath it but red soil and hope and despair, lack of hope and despair. And on top of that, if you got to cut the trees down, you got to get the stumps out. Otherwise, you've got you don't have a straight path in your way. And understand this: if those of you from farmer territory, a lot of you have never seen a farm in your life other than a book. But just understand this: is that unlike today, where you can have these hundreds and hundreds of acre farms, most of these people in Texas are not going to be coming with their own. I guess you could say their own army of slaves or servants. The reality is that most of the settlers who come to Texas, if they come with a slave, they come with one or two at most, and many of them don't even come with that. Most of them, frankly, don't. There are people who have slaves. Certainly, they in Mexico will touch on this issue in a few minutes. But Mexico does not call them slaves per se. It's an indentured servitude contract after about 1825. But if they're slaves, all the same. But the reality is that unless you're Jared Gross, and if you're wondering who Jared Gross was, I put that on that exam just so for those to reward those who had read closely. So if unless you're Jared Gross, and Jared Gross was a very prominent settler in Austin's early colony, he had a lot of slaves. He had a lot of property when he comes to Texas. So he'd be the exception, the really singular exception to the rule, basically. You wouldn't want to, you don't have that much opportunity to plow all that land, and so you're not going to have a big plantation. You'll sell your crop, you'll send it off to market and what have you, in addition to whatever you keep. But the idea of having large mechanized farms like you have today is just so distant in the future. They don't know that, they're not expecting that. So that's a real problem for those East Texas boys and those colonies out in East Texas. Yeah, it looks good on paper. Yeah, you get plenty of rain. Yeah, there's some people who live there. Yeah, there were Indians in the past, and they lived there and did all right. But for what the Anglos want to do, going to Austin's colony or Clack Robertson's colony, or even Gonzalez's, the colony DeWitt has with Gonzalez, or even to a degree Martin de Leon's operation, all those are far more attractive for farming because of the river valleys that they have within them than are in East Texas, even with the Trinity River. It's just the flora and the fauna. Are there farms in East Texas? Of course there are. But the problem is it's just not large enough. Okay? Another issue you've got with those East Texas boys and their colonial operation is that those East Texas boys, Zavala, Valine, and Burnett, all three of them, they really are kind of shifty characters at times. Lorenzo de Zavala is going to be on the nameplate of half a dozen schools within about a 100-mile radius of where I'm sitting right now. In addition to that, Zavala is named for a county. He is going to be, there's probably a city, I'm pretty certain there's a city name for him. Obviously, many towns and, many schools, many streets, all that sort of stuff. Lorenzo de Zavala. And he's a good guy in overall sense, I figure. His people jokingly called him Lorenzo, jokingly. They were also sincere when they said it too, but they called him Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lorenzo the Magnificent almost sounds like a circus name. Some sort of great carnival barker. But no, he was a very prominent man in Mexican politics in the 1820s. You're going to hear a lot about him today as well, probably in a future lecture from me. We claim him in Texas as a founding father, as it were, in Texas, but his real work as a historical character is done in Mexico. One of the things that Zavala and other Mexican leaders would do is they would try to make money and they would try to enrich themselves by being in position and power. Now, I don't want to make it sound like Zavala had his hand all the way into the till, dipping it out, but corruption and hocus pocus and a little, a little bit of payola. That's all pit and parcel for politics in Mexico in the 1820s and 1830s, and frankly, parts of the United States then as well, and frankly, in both nations' case, even today. Some men go into office, may not even really have an interest in becoming a great person, doing great things. In fact, probably they don't. To think that people go to the Congress just because they want to help humanity, well, whatever. The reality is that Zavala, yes, he had dreams from Mexico, but Zavala also wanted to increase his own lot. He wanted to become wealthy, and selling land in East Texas was one of those methods he employed. Joseph Allein is a German immigrant, and Joseph Allein is also part of this land speculative operation as well. And last but not least, David G. Burnett, like Zavala, Burnett is going to be all over the place in Texas today, where you see names, streets, counties, towns. In fact, west of Austin, there's a town, Burnett, Texas. Well, the reality is you don't call it Burnett, Texas. It is Burnett in their terminology of language, and that's fine and good. But as one guy said, it's Burnett, darn it, and you better learn it, as only a Texan could say it. But the reality is that Burnett, David G. Burnett, will be the first what they call the ad interim president of Texas, and his vice president, the first ad interim vice president of Texas, Lorenzo de Zavala. Both of those men are extraordinarily influential in early Texas. Zavala dies right at the end of the Revolution, basically 36. But Burnett will have a legacy that goes beyond. And by the way, David G. Burnett and Sam Houston absolutely hate each other. It is a real, well, that if we don't get time to talk about it, so be it at the end of the semester. Reality is that the Republic of Texas has got some real strong personalities, and one of the strongest personalities is David G. Burnett. And sometimes he looks like more of a grumpy old man than he is anything else. But those are the characters of history. That's what kind of makes it interesting. So what makes this East Texas thing okay, bad? Well, we discussed the fact that bad in the sense what makes it fail. We discussed the fact that it just doesn't have a great amount of arable land that is easily turned into larger scale farms for the era. The other issue they've got is that frankly a lot of that stuff in East Texas was basically land swindling, land speculation on a grandiose scale. It's not kind of unlike what Bowie does in Louisiana, which we'll come to in due time in the class, and that's impressive. That's industrial scale swindling. Or even the Austin family. Stephen Austin was speculating heavily in Arkansas along with Moses in Missouri and elsewhere, and we talked about that in class already. But this East Texas stuff is kind of in between there. Bowie's attempted stealing of southwestern Louisiana, Arkansas, with Austin's just speculating and frankly failing. Well, anyways, what it was, this East Texas thing is these three East Texas colonies are going to be combined into a business. And so really one of the things that those Mexican colonization laws talked about, and I put that on there for a reason. Again, I didn't talk about it in class, but those who did their due diligence, in this case went to the Texas State Historical Association online, the Handbook of Texas Online, you found it. And that's what I wanted you to look up. The Mexican colonization laws had several provisions in it to kind of protect Mexico and the Mexicans from, well, swindlers, rank speculators, and so on. And I do differentiate between a swindler and a speculator. A speculator would be generally legal and above board, and though he'll probably tweak the law, perhaps even violate the law knowingly. Whereas well, I guess you say, whereas a swindler, at times like Bowie, is just trying to steal everything in sight that's not bolted down or a red hot stove. So when you talk about that East Texas stuff, Allein, Zavala, and Burnett, when you talk about those three men, this is where they went wrong. Number one, they put together a corporation and they combined those 3 grants into one. They combined those 3 grants. How do you like that for high tech, show and tell stuff? Take a hand, put it into a fist, combine it into one. And what they called it was the Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company. The Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company. And so that in and of itself is not necessarily illegal in Mexico. Having a land company, a holding company like that, that's not exactly legal. But where it really runs afoul of the Mexican colonization laws is in these 2 facets right here. Well, really 3 facets. The Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company, in effect, was a swindling operation for these 3 things. Number one, it is going to be chartered not in Mexico, but in New York City. The laws of Mexico, the colonization laws, I believe it's also a constitutional part for them as well. It says that no corporations active in Mexico can be headquartered in any other place but Mexico. The idea to be able to control the goings on of these corporations. So this Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company, is headquartered in New York City. So that's strike number one. Strike number two. The Mexican colonization laws that distribute all this land said that these grants could not be combined. They could not be administered jointly. It was designed to diffuse it and keep these big chunks of land out of the hand of speculators or, frankly, nefarious men. Well, they combined all those grants together, so they're all operating together out of New York City. So that's strike number two, mentioning strike number one as well. Strike number three is this. The Mexican colonization laws dealing with Texas also said you could not sell land script, land paper. That in order to get to clear title, good title to your land, you had to go see the commissioner. And of course, that was the answer to that true-false question. The most important person in a colony, almost seemingly outside the impresario himself, is the land commissioner. That commissioner gives you the title. He issues you the title. If he's not around McMullen and McGloin, even you can have all the impresarios in the world, it just doesn't work. The Mexicans are not going to recognize those claims. And they also said you couldn't sell pieces of paper and said, here, promissory notes, basically saying, here's my notes, give me my land. That is illegal in Mexico, yet that's what they did in East Texas, in that Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company. What they did is they went around New York City especially, and they were trolling for recent Irish immigrants as well, and also some Germans for that matter too, but really the Irish. And they're trolling along saying basically, if you drop everything you have, it's a hard life in New York City, move to Texas, get cheap land, get almost free land, and restart your life. Come now, don't wait, don't hesitate. Well, some people bit. There's always going to be, I don't want to say a sucker, because at times it's what they feel like, but they certainly were sincere people who were trying to make a better life for themselves. But they got suckered into a swindle, and they got down to Anahuac, which is really the point into these colonies for East Texas. Anahuac's at the mouth of across the bay from the mouth of the Trinity River. They got down there and they started presenting these promissory notes. Here's my note. Where's my land? And this basically the answer comes back: the land is not yours. You're going to have to pay for it yourself. Yes, you can get some, but this note has no value in Mexico or Mexican Texas. Same difference, I suppose. And so you have a lot of outraged people. So I guess in a sense, when you talk about the coming of the Texas Revolution, one of the things to keep in mind is the issue not just of a cultural clash, which I talked about before, between the Tejanos and the Anglos smashing heads, especially the women, over the issue of what you dress like, what you look like, what you talk like, what you believe, etc. One of the other issues, and it's really as big as the cultural, I would say it's 1A and 1B sort of thing. It's a political issue. And one of the political issues is how do we handle, into the coming of the Texas Revolution, how do we handle the land situation? How do we adjudicate and hand out pieces of land? How do we control the swindlers? Because not everybody, using Bowie again as an example, Bowie has come down to us as kind of a hero. And in a sense, he is. He certainly put his neck on the line, and he certainly fought at times underhandedly, but sometimes overboard, correctly. But then again, war is not fair. but he certainly fought for Texas Revolution, and in that sense, he is a laudable man. But his background is checkered, and people didn't always trust Bowie because of his dealings in Louisiana, frankly, and in Texas. So, how do we handle the land situation? Those are always going to be early questions in the Republic of Texas and in the Revolutionary period. What about the land and the politics of it? Do we protect the land and protect the people from the ravenous swindlers, or do we just get the land out into the public as fast as possible, grow Texas as quickly as possible, and hope for the best? So there's really a political element to the coming of the Texas Revolution, and that's all going on in East Texas, and it's unsettled. There are going to be other uh, colonies and so forth out there. Another colony that's worth a mention of our time is just right up the road from probably where you're sitting. If you're watching this in Bryan College Station as for this class, you really only have to go about, especially depending on where in Bryan you're sitting, you only have to go about 2, 3, 5, 10 miles at most, and you will be in this man's colony, and that man's name is Sterling Clack Robertson. Sterling Clack Robertson. Booger County, Robertson County, is named for that man. But Sterling Robertson's colony is much larger than the county that bears his name. It basically runs up the Brazos River all the way to the stone's throw from Baylor University, really all the way into Milam County to the west, into Falls County up the river, and off to the east up around Limestone County and what have you. So it's a fairly wide swath, about 40 to 50 miles either side of the river, headed up toward Waco. That's the colony itself. Now, it is actually fairly successful. It has a lot of deep Southerners deep South boys who come in and settle along the banks of the Brazos River. It's going to have two colonies in it. It's going to have two capitals in it. The first capital is at a place called Saraville, and that is in Falls County, and it's really not a successful place. And they moved the colony's capital southward down on the banks of the Brazos, out west of today's Hearne, Texas, and they will put it on the banks of the Brazos, and it's called Nashville. And that's kind of a landing on the Brazos River. And it's the Brazos is somewhat navigable up to that part of the world. Quite honestly, the Brazos River is only navigable past Washington on the Brazos, just right down the road from us. Of course, that's where the Texas Declaration of Independence will be signed. But it's only navigable past that point occasionally because there's a set of naturally occurring falls on the Brazos River that basically prevent steamboat traffic from going beyond Washington. And frankly, that's part of the reason Washington is a successful town in the 19th century, is because it's kind of a terminus for those, an end of the line for those steamboats. And then if you go up past those falls, let's say you can get a boat past those falls just up from Washington, then you go up the river, you're okay for the most part till you get to about today's Marlin. That's where Saraville was. Anyways, the problem with Marlin is that as the name of the county is, it's called Falls County. Well, Falls County, Marlin, has another set of naturally occurring falls that you really can't get past on only the best of conditions as a boat operator, and that basically means at high tide, and really when you've had a lot of rain. Bluntly put, there was only one noted a time in the 19th century in Texas, and this transcends the Republic era, this transcends the Revolutionary period. It's all the way through to when the steamboats go away. There's only one noted time that I'm aware of that, and I feel almost 92% certain, not much more than that, but about 92% certain that there was only one time a steamboat got all the way to Waco. Now, boats obviously traveled up and down the Brazos and what have you. I don't take nothing away from that. But a steamboat going from the mouth of the Brazos at Velasco, or Freeport to us, all the way up to Waco, that happened one time. So it's you're really getting in the interior of Texas, but it is really good farmland. And quite honestly, in the late 19th century, or about 1900 even, a town that today is kind of just a little old ghost town. It's trying to make a comeback as a junk and perhaps a niche market as a confectionery and chocolate and kind of a tourist attraction. It's out in the middle of northern Robertson County. It's called Calvert. Calvert today is not much to look at, but Calvert in 1900, 1890 was a very wealthy town. You can see it in the leftover architecture from that era. They have churches there, have beautiful woodworking and tin work on the interior. And I don't mean tin like on a roof of a tin sort of thing. I'm talking about pressed tin that is really impressive. If you've ever been to Cafe Capri in downtown Bryan, you look at the ceiling, that's a kind of a pressed tin that I'm talking about. It's really nice and really good. It's emblematical of that era. A lot of houses that are also impressive. But there was a lot of cotton grown in that colony in the during its period. In fact, Sterling Robertson's colony, in some respects, is just about as for cotton growing at least, was about as successful as old Austin's colony. Anyways, Robertson, just kind of wrap old Robertson up in a nice bow. He's not a likable guy. But then again, a lot of those guys in early Texas aren't likable, and kind of what makes Bowie an interesting person is that he is likable. When you talk about Robertson, Robertson, and Austin are going to go hammer and tong after each other in the 1830s over land grants and this and that. And it's really kind of a greedy situation. Throw into the mix a man named Samuel May Williams, whom we talked about briefly before, is Austin's land agent and commissioner after the Baron de Bastrop passes. Austin, Williams will be close together like so, and then they will fight it out at times around 1830, 34, 35 with Robertson banging their heads against each other. There's a lot of politics in there, a lot of land issues in there. Those two don't always get along. What's interesting, and you can't see it, is I'm sitting here looking at a map on my wall of Burleson County. That's my home county. I'm from Snook, you know, me with a country boy with the accent. The fact of the matter is that if you look at this map that I've got on the wall, and there's others all over, you know, for Burleson and Brazos and Robertson and what have you, is that you can see clearly on this map. It's an old lithograph from the mid-19th century, post-revolutionary period, but it's got on there the old league lines and the old leagues that where the land grants were. And I'm sitting in the John Hollingsworth League, which is a quarter league granted in the 1830s by Austin. And then there's some big ones like John Cole's, and then you'll see Stephen Austin set off a few for himself in the county. But then you see the line running through it, which is basically El Camino Real, or the old San Antonio Road, or OSR to us in modern travel terminology. And then you see right above OSR, you see Clack Robertson's colony. And Clack Robertson's colony is just a jumble. I mean, it is this, that, and the other. I mean, whereas to Austin's credit, there was a uniformity and a precision allowing for the times, but there was a uniformity, a precision, a knowledge of what you own, where it was, the meets, the bounds, all that sort of stuff, the varas, the steps, all those found rocks and trees. Austin did a great job with that, to his credit. Clack Robertson, it looks like at times, if you look at the map sitting on my wall, it looks like Clack Robertson basically said, you want some land here, I'll give it to you, and where do you want it? Okay, that sounds fine, because you'll see these names just overlaid over top of each other. Some of it, I think, has to do with the fact he gave land to men who were Anglo, and there were some Tejanos who already had claims on that land, and he gave it to them, and he gave it over top, so there's an overlay there, but some of it is just slipshod operations. One looks like a fairly uniform operation, the other looks like the city of Houston without zoning. I mean, basically, you can have everything stacked up on top of each other, or to say it differently, it looks like my desk. So you can't see that either, and you should be glad you can't see my desk. It's really it's dirty. Or you've seen my office if you walked in, not so organized. That's Sterling Clack Robertson. So anyways, those two men will have their issues. The last person I want to discuss about these other impresarios, these other land agents in Texas, is the only woman, and her name is, and she was on the review sheet as well, Jane McManus Storm Casnew. That's a lot of names. Let that sink in for a second. I'll say it again. Jane McManus Storm Casnew. She is a youngish woman when she comes to Texas. Youngish in the sense she's in her 20s, mid-20s. Give me a second here to get some coffee. It's morning when I'm doing this, so I've got to refuel a little bit. So, Jane McManus stormed Casnews, the only female impresario in Texas in this era. And she is a failure. I mean, let's be honest about what it is. She is also one of those New York land agents who's come down to Texas to try to figure out how we can make money. But her story is much more interesting than just being a failed land agent in Texas. It's kind of like that Borden story I told you about in class, how Borden's with the they were trying to take advantage of that cult of true womanhood business, and how you had the floating bathhouse, but that's just part of the story. They had the marvelous meat biscuit, but in addition to that, really what makes the Borden name is the evaporated milk. Jane McManus stormed Casnews in the same sort of territory there. Her life as an impresario, that just gets us to talk about her, and if all I said was she was the first female impresario, it would really just be kind of a factoid. Meaning that, yeah, that's nice, but it really has no impact. But she does have impact, and it's not as much as in Texas as it is elsewhere. Her life was rather rambunctious. By the way, there's no photographs of her for whatever, or at least there were none that survived. No daguerreotypes, and the closest thing we have, there's a book on my shelf off to my left. There's a book on my shelf that talks about her specifically, and the closest we have is kind of this oblique, kind of a vague reference to in a photo, or not a photo, but a portrait painted that's supposedly her, but might not be. So kind of like William Barrett Travis, we really don't know exactly what she looked like. People who saw her said that she was raven-haired. I mean, her hair was as black as night, and she had kind of an olive complexion and olive eyes about her, kind of green eyes. But the fact was is that people who saw her said she just was beautiful. Beautiful. And she led a rambunctious life. Evidently in her teens, late teens I think it was, she had developed an affection and a friendship, and more particularly a romantic relationship with a fellow named Aaron Burr. Now, you're thinking, well, I've heard that name before. Didn't you mention it in class a few weeks ago or a couple days ago? And I said, yeah, I did. I mentioned Burr in context, probably to the context of that failed southwestern adventure that he had trying to create his own little personal fiefdom. Well, Aaron Burr is a scoundrel. He is somebody who never should have been let anywhere near the halls of power. And fortunately, he was only vice president. And fortunately, the vice president, or talking to the president, did not die. And the president is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's one of his bigger mistakes was he got into bed politically with Aaron Burr. In fact, Jefferson said about Burr, he said he was a crooked gun, and there was no difference, no knowing which way he would go off. His aim was never sure. And Burr, by the way, is also going to shoot down and kill Alexander Hamilton in a rather famous duel in about 1803, 1804. And in addition to that, Aaron Burr is going to be charged with treason. And in addition to that, he is the worst of the ambitious men you could ever come across this side of they're really truly bad guys. But he was ambitious. Luckily, there were better men who also had some starch about them that were able to block him. And ultimately, when you talk about Aaron Burr, he's remembered my printer just went off on me, unfortunately. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I forgot about the fact that my printer's on right now, and, well, you're going to get a sound there. So anyways, Aaron Burr, it didn't print. Well, anyways, that's the joy of recording here in a somewhat live, non-captive, non-studio environment. So you never know what happens next. I mean, before long, Milton, is he behind me? No, Milton's not behind me, so you never know what could walk through here. So, well, anyways, where was I? Aaron Burr. Oh, yeah, scoundrel. Real zero. Aaron Burr, I remember what it was. I was talking about him and the fact that he was able to drain a woman's account. Aaron Burr was a charismatic man. He was a con man, and you know as well as I do, or at least you should. You'll figure it out if you don't. Hopefully you'll figure it out. Is that here we go again. So the great con men are always going to... The great con men are nice when they want to be. In fact, most of the time they are always nice. But that's what makes them so devilish and ticklish, is that Burr, knowing he was a celebrity, knowing he was a powerful figure in New York, seduced this younger woman and marries her for her money and then drains the banking accounts. The woman was about 30, 35 evidently, and Burr's about 50, I think he was at the time. Well, somewhere in that same neighborhood, same territory, he and Jane McManus, or Jane, Jane Storm. No, I'm going to get the names right. She's got about a million names. Jane McManus, there you go. Jane McManus at that time, she's late teens, Burr's in his 50s. They have a romantic relationship. McManus is one of the daughters of one of Burr's business partners, land stuff. So that memory serves as Robert McManus. But no matter is that eventually that was going to kind of get the impetus for her to come down to Texas and start her life as a failed impresario. She's up around Waco. She lives under a person's house, a family house, for about 3 or 4 months, dang near starving to death. I mean, she gets fed, but that's all they can say is, well, we don't have room in the house. You can sleep under the house, and that'll be okay. Well, she finally gets back on her feet. She knew how to read. She knew how to write, so that was to her advantage, and she was good at it. She was good at the writing. Well, she eventually, and there's something else that comes right there. So the fact of the matter is, when you talk about old Jane, is that she's going to move down to Eagle Pass after the Revolution was over. This would have been in the late 1830s, early 1840s, and so she's down at Eagle Pass with a husband, a fellow named Storm, Casnew. She'd already been married once before, a fellow named Storm. It's a convoluted story. Long story short is this, though. I'm trying to get this done. I'm getting distracted a little bit here or there. But the long story short is this. Her marital life was an open book, figuratively and literally. Even by today's standards, the fact was she and her husband kept multiple friends around, if you catch my drift. In addition to that, she was a writer of great ability. She was going to be published. She will be published in newspapers throughout the United States in the 1840s and 50s and beyond. And sometimes she's under a nom de plume, a name that is a male name. Then sometimes she's published under her own name or a woman's name. She's published in a lot of different ways, but she is not published in a lot of newspapers. Anyways, last two things is this, or three things really. One, she's a spy for the Polk administration down in Mexico City when we go to war with Mexico in the mid-1840s, 45, 46, and so on, 46, 48, 7, 48. When we go to war with Mexico, she's a spy for the Polk administration. And on top of that, in that same time period, I believe, and I think I can back it up, is that she coined a very important phrase in American history, and that phrase is manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. That idea that America, the United States, had a God-given, and I mean that fully in a spiritual, heavenly sense, that America had a God-given right to extend from sea to shining sea. That the land was theirs for our settlement, for our development, for our usage, and it was our duty to do so. She coined the phrase. Others pick it up, run with it, and give him credit for it, but I think it's Jane McManus Storm Casnew who does it. At the end of her life, which will actually take her life, I believe it was in the 1880s, she is on a trip. She is on a trip from New York City down to San Juan, Puerto Rico. And she is going through what's called the Bermuda Triangle. And as only befitting a woman who's got a married name in there of Storm. Her life ends when the ship she's riding on goes down in a storm and is sunk and lost at sea in the Bermuda Triangle. So for a person who in Texas history more or less failed, the fact of the matter is she kept and had a very prominent life and a very successful life, and did quite well in her developments and her activities. So these impresarios, and there's a few other minor ones that I've left out, which comes to mind up in northeast Texas, but the fact of the matter is that these colonists, these impresarios, they're a varied and different lot. And this impresario business, in a modified sense, takes place even after the Revolution, especially thinking about the Germans coming to Texas, that sort of thing. Well, that's that on Texas. So we've got Texas set up, and Texas is doing okay. And truth be told, when it comes to Texas during this era, the Mexicans were never particularly interested in Texas other than are there people moving to Texas? Who's moving to Texas? And is it going to make us some money and help develop the province? And probably that is an oversimplification in a sense, but that's basically what the Mexicans were up to. And I think it's fair to say, and it's important to remember, that in the 1820s especially, and into the 1830s until 34, 35 territory, the Mexicans, the Mexican government, only rarely worried about Texas. Quite honestly, the Mexican government looked upon Texas kind of like many Americans look upon North Dakota. Is that it's just not something we care a whole lot about unless there's oil coming out of the Bakken Shale. And if there's no oil coming out of the Bakken Shale, nobody cares about, and frankly, a lot of people don't even know where the oil comes from. Well, it's just there. North Dakota's just there. How many of you been to Miles City, Montana? Nobody goes to Miles City, Montana. Nothing wrong with it. Probably a very nice town, but it's not exactly a top tourist destination. It's not cosmopolitan, and the Mexicans look upon Texas that way. So really, if you look at the question of what are the Texians up to, the Mexicans are just simply not bothering with it right now. And the only times you really see them is when they get a momentary blip of concern, such as, say, in 1829 and 1830. I'll give that quickly because I want to transition us into Mexican politics and round out the rest of the class. I'm looking at the counter on the clock. I've just spent 40 minutes talking about a handful of Empresarios. I guess I need to quit being so long-winded. But in Mexico, in the late 1820s, Mexico is racked by upheaval and coup and counter coup and what have you. It's a real mess. Real mess. By 1829, you're going to have a government come into power called the Escoceses. Sometimes, probably more likely in your textbook, they're going to be called the Centralists. And I'll go into the various political factions in a second, but the Escoceses, the Centralists, synonymous terms, they really don't trust the United States, and I think historically looking back at it, probably were right. The Yorkino faction, which is their other main political adversary, kind of like Republicans and Democrats are political adversaries and sometimes even enemies. The Escoceses and Yorkinos have two different views and two different worldviews. The Escoceses said, General Manuel Mieri Terán, you need to take a trip through Texas. This is in 1829. General Manuel Mieri Terán. General Manuel Mieri Terán is I think really an honest guy overall. He's not a blank slate. He's not completely unbiased, if there's ever such a person as that. He is a centralist. He is he's a true blue Mexican, meaning he is a loyal Mexican, but he's not misty-eyed about states' rights. He's not misty-eyed about the United States. He's not misty-eyed about the Americans in Texas. And so Manuel Mieri Terán comes up to Texas in what's basically a quote-unquote border inspection, kind of a swing around the circle to see how everything's doing, wave the flag. It's supposed to be real friendly. But he was here in Texas. Manuel Mieri Terán is in Texas for ulterior motives. And that ulterior motive was to basically see how peaceable, not passable, how pacific the Anglos in Texas were, and what's the story up here. And so when Manuel Mieri Terán passes through Texas, he goes and dines with the Tejanos in San Antonio. He dines with Stephen F. Austin in San Felipe. He dines up in Nacogdoches, and it's really a general swing around the circle, and everybody tries to put on their best face and impress. Austin pulled out all the stops, but Manuel Mieri Terán was not impressed. He was not impressed, and he basically thought Austin was a solemn scoundrel intriguing against Mexico. And I'm just paraphrasing just a little bit. But yeah, Manuel Mieri Terán, literally called Austin a solemn scoundrel. But then again, Mexican politics was very full of scoundrels, so maybe he was a little bit jaundiced in that sense. Manuel Mieri Terán was. But what he comes back, the general comes back to Mexico City with is a rather eye-opening and alarming report. It's kind of like thinking everything's fine, and then all of a sudden one of your trusted subordinates goes off and reports back, oh, by the way, you've got major issues. Your cattle are full of worms, and the fence are down. You need to do something. Well, Manuel Mier-Terran's report basically is that the Anglos are overrunning Texas, and they're going to take it, and we have better get something under control here. We better get this immigration issue under control. What happens next is, in a sense, almost like, maybe it's just what it is with the Western Hemisphere. These sorts of issues pop up from time to time. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And the more times change, the more they stay the same. Well, what you're going to get out of that Manuel Mier-Terran report, the Mexican Congress is going to pass a law, and it's called the Law of April 6th of 1830. The Law of April 6th of 1830. If you did your due diligence in your reading in your textbook, you probably should have come through it already, come across that law. I did not use that on the exam. It's just, but it is one of the major, it's really one of the few major pieces of Mexican legislation that deal with the issue of Texas and Texians directly. Those colonization laws certainly would be something from earlier times, but basically they don't. And that law basically said is that there shall be effectively no new Anglo immigration to Texas after this date here. There were a couple of exceptions and set-asides for Austin and for slaves and that sort of stuff eventually put in. But effectively, this is an anti-immigration bill that comes out of the Mexican Congress that is designed to stop Texas immigration and set the course right. And from the Mexican perspective, I can't really blame them, because they looked around and said, there are all these Anglos, thousands more than Tejanos. They have a Protestant background, they have a Anglo background, they have an English background, they're probably still beholden to the United States and who knows what else. Agents, kind of like a Houston running around. We'll see. But the Mexicans were sobered up for a time on the Texas question. What shall we do with Texas? Stop immigration. Now, ultimately, what ends up hurting the Mexicans with this immigration business is they have the law, but they really don't have the will or the ability to enforce it, because Mexico is so turbulent, and Mexico is not very strong of a nation. And so that's a good jumping off point from Texas, with all the settlers and immigrants and all that sort of fun stuff, to Mexico, Mexican politics in the 1820s and the 1830s. So we're setting up. We've got the United States squared away with Jackson as President of the United States trying to buy Texas, and the Mexicans resolutely saying no. We got the Texians, which are becoming more and more Anglo, and the Texians, which are becoming, in some respects, more and more rambunctious, which we'll get to in the last few lectures of the class. And then last but not least, you've got the Mexicans with all their shortcomings and foibles in their body politic being dealt with in there. And so that's where we are now. So with regard to the Mexicans, the Mexican state and the Mexican political situation, Mexico in general in the 1820s, we kind of need to lay out what does it look like. Well, first things first is that you have a society that is very different from the United States. And so in many respects, for the next rest of this lecture and the next lecture after that, I'm going to kind of play compare and contrast. And I think it's very instructive how two nations, the United States and Mexico, could be so similar in some respects in the choices they make, and different in other respects, by the way. The choices they make will be absolutely fundamental to the route they take for the next 100 years. In the 1820s, Mexico, unlike the United States, did not have social mobility. In the United States, only in the United States, could you have somebody like Andrew Jackson. Come from nowhere. The man is born in raging poverty. He has no father to speak of. His dad's dead. His family's gone. But Jackson, yet through his own ability, maybe some providential handiwork there as well, but his own ability, will to go and to triumph, becomes president of the United States. But before that, he was a prominent man in his own territory, and he was wealthy. That's the American dream, to go from nothing and become something. and in some cases go from nothing and become a great man. Bill Clinton, in a more modern sense, would be not Barack Obama, but Bill Clinton would be an example of that to me, because Bill Clinton's family life, his early life, was very poor and very weak, and yet here he is. He's a very wealthy man, respected statesman, and a former president. So obviously, you can still do that American dream bit. He obviously, Clinton, like Jackson, had a lot of ability. But that's not true in Mexico. Mexico, you are what you were born to be, and that's kind of where I'd like to start off with here. Is that the United States allows upward mobility, social mobility, but Mexico, frankly, does not. A lot of it depends on what your bloodlines are. What are your bloodlines? What are your bloodlines? Today, we don't worry about those things as much as even Americans did 100, 125 years ago. 125 years ago, if I walked into a area, they probably wouldn't ask me if ask me about my skin color. They'd ask me about what my last name is, and they say, "Oh, you're German. Well, we don't like those types around here. Get out of here." Not so much today, but in Mexico, in that time period, and to a certain degree, even to today, Mexico still has a caste system, if you like, kind of a la the Indians, but it's Indians like subcontinental Indians. The fact of the matter is that when you talk about this caste in Mexico, it is not very movable. You are what you were born to be, and really, I would ask you to think about it for a second. In a sense, it's kind of reassuring. Now, that may sound strange to an American ear, but it's true. I would argue, as a historian through more countries than just Mexico, that if you are born what you were born to be, you know what your job is. You know what the expectations are. You know where you can't fall beyond, and you at the same time obviously know where you can't get above. You're right there, and in that sense, offers some great security, and you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry. Somebody else will take care of the bigger issues. I can just live my life in peace, or maybe hard work and toil, certainly, but I don't have to make heavy and weighty decisions. And the elite in Mexico make those decisions. And the elite in Mexico are what are called the blancos, the whites. The whites. The blancos of Mexico make up 22% of society. Now, here's some high-tech stuff that I was working on before I hit the record button for this thing. So here's some high-tech graphics for you. There you go. That, you can probably hit pause. Let me move that over so my beautiful face doesn't get obscured by this yellow notebook. Here is the percentages for Mexico in the time period we're discussing, the 1820s. Got it? You can hit the pause button, write all that sort of stuff down. Let's maybe draw in just a little bit so you can see better. Okay, and we'll set it down. For the blancos, there are really two groups in there. The highest of the high, the elite of the elite, the stratosphere of the stratosphere, those folks are called Peninsulars. Peninsulars. They make up approximately 6% of the population. Peninsulars do. And then below them, just slightly below them, are a much larger group, the Criollos or Criollas. There are two different ways you can spell it I've seen over the years, and those are the two main ones that I've seen. And they make up approximately 16% of the population. And why they're called the Blancos group is that it has everything to do with their blood. Their blood is pure Spaniard. Pure Spaniard. There's been no mixture and adulteration of it. There has been no anything. Now, what is it about the Peninsulares that set them high and above everything else? In the 1820s in Mexico, you're coming off of the hundreds of years of Spanish domain. Peninsulares is somebody whose family is not only pure-blooded Spaniard, but get this, and this is probably going to sound strange to your ears as an American, is that you are born in Spain. It got to the point in some cases that a woman who found out and recognized she was pregnant would load up on a boat with her servants. A couple of her servants, they would go back to the ancestral home in Spain, have the baby on Spanish soil, and then a little bit later, 6 months, a year when it's proper, will return to Mexico with the family. It is that big of a deal to be born on Spanish soil, and it is what makes you a Peninsulares. It's where you're born, and they control most of the wealth, and not most of the, they control most of the wealth in Mexico that is controlled in private hands. that is in private hands. So 6%, the real political power and much of the economic power of Mexico is found in the Peninsulares. Next up, the Criollos are just as pure-blooded as the Peninsulares. Their Spanish DNA is not mixed with anybody's. But the problem is that they, at some point along the route, were born in Mexico, and perhaps it goes all the way back to when the family first showed up. But their family has a history of being born in Mexico, and so when the first baby, especially the male-born, but the first baby is dropped in Mexico and had in Mexico, that ruins it, as it were, for the rest of your family's legacy. You are what you're born to be, and you can't unring that proverbial bell. And so these two groups will butt heads. And in truth be told, I think I'm pretty certain I mentioned this to you in class about how this all washes out in the Mexican Revolution. Obviously, if you're Peninsulares, you more or less are going to back the Spanish royalists, the Spaniards, in their Mexican Revolution. If you are a Criollos, you really kind of want Mexican independence, because this is your opportunity to get to the top of the heap and kind of bump off the Peninsulares and shove them over the cliff. Really, one of the greater issues in Mexico in the 1820s is, what do we do with the Peninsulares? There will be some arguments, there will be there will be laws written over that subject. Shall we drive out the Peninsulares like you drive out a leper from a colony? And the answer for some Mexicans, especially the Yorquino faction, was, in fact, yes, let's get rid of these guys. They are nothing but pains in the butt. They have money that we want, and frankly, the Criollos are trying to be the top dogs. And that's what they do a little bit. So the Criollos are envious, covetous of the Peninsulares position. The Criollos are, in their own right, dominant forces in Mexico, but they make up a larger portion of the population at 16%. But below them, and this is a barrier that cannot be crossed very easily. Certainly can't be crossed with blood, but it can be a little bit crossed with ability, because you will find a few mestizo, meaning mixed blood. You will find a few mestizo men who become powerful in Mexico, but for all intents and purposes is that doesn't really happen. Mestizos can sometimes own haciendas. They can own land in Mexico. They have those sorts of things, but they have economic ability. The De Leon family, in a sense, in Texas, are kind of out of this mestizo background. The fact of the matter is that even if they own land and have influence in their specific sphere of territory, their land, geography, influence, politics, whatever, they'll never be able to ascend the heights of power and become, say, a president of Mexico. They will never become the most powerful in Mexico in this era. There's just not going to be that. But the mestizo also make up a good portion of the population, and that is at 22%. At 22%. So, but they still make up a large portion of the population. And last but not least is the vast majority of Mexico's population, and they are called Indios, or just simply to us, Indians. The Indians. They are 60% of the population. 60% of the population is Indian. You remember back from a lecture when I was talking about the Mexican Revolution basically in 1810 with Father Miguel Hidalgo. Before the Plan de Iguala went through, long before that, you remember Father Hidalgo had organized an Indian army that attacked and took Mexico City, attacked and took other, I believe it was Guanajuato, but took other Mexican cities, ransacked it, and Hidalgo, who himself is actually fairly highborn, has a real affinity for the Indians, and he organizes them. The Criollos had hoped to use the Indians to their advantage, but the Criollos were mistaken in thinking that the Indians would pass them by. The Indians were most interested in getting back, as it were. Well, there's that issue too. If you are an Indian, you are, as I've talked about before, you are the peon, in all honesty. Some mestizos can be peons, some mestizos can be patrons. The Criollos or the Peninsulares, they're always the patrons. But the Indians are pretty much always the peons. Those are the laborers, and those are that class. And a couple of things I need to touch on is that Mexico in this time period, as far as their labor is concerned, is going to be that patron system, that patron peon system. When you discuss labor in Mexico in the 1820s, one of the things that's brought up, especially with the Texas question and the American original sin of slavery, um, for good, and I would argue more often seemingly not for good. It seems like most of the time when this issue of slavery is brought up, it colors the whole story. And I agree slavery is extraordinarily important in the American history. But sometimes we try to make everything about slavery when I'm not certain that it is. In Mexico, one of the things that is brought up about the Texas Revolution is that Mexico had outlawed slavery in the 1820s, and Texas had slaves, and on from there, and oh, how horrible, and look how virtuous Mexico was. The truth be told, when it comes to Mexico and their outlawing of slavery, is they outlawed slavery not because they woke up one morning and said, you know what, we are making tons of money over with slaves a la the South in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. We're not making tons of money with the slaves. We're not pumping out that. Mexico doesn't wake up one morning and say, you know what, even though we're doing that, we need to rip out this institution root and branch. Because that's effectively what happened in the United States. The South made money off the slavery institution. The North, amongst other things, got righteous about, at least the abolitionists did, got righteous over the issue of slavery and decided, regardless of the economic cost, we must eradicate this institution, this wicked institution amongst us. That's the American story in a sense. But in Mexico, they never had that. Mexico in the 1820s, I believe it was 25, it may have been 26, but the Mexican Congress outlawed slavery. And it really wasn't that controversial except in parts of Texas at most, but there weren't that many Anglos in Texas at that time anyways. And it really wasn't controversial, and it really wasn't traumatic in the sense that you have a revolution over the subject. Why is that? Well, Mexico never had that many slaves by the 1820s because they had a different labor system already in place, and it's the peon-patron system. A peon is absolutely dependent upon his patron, much like a slave is to his master. That, by the way, that's why I don't get worked up over the slavery issue in Mexico, and I don't hold Mexico up as this great paragon of virtue. They got rid of slavery because they didn't need it. It wasn't that big a deal to them. Few people had slaves, sure, but it was the patron system was the labor system. Let me be clear about this, and I was hinting at it prior to the exam. I'm going to be absolutely crystal clear now. If you are a patron, you have life or death control over your peon. A peon is owed religion, some shelter, some clothing, some food. But the patron is owed not just undying, but more particularly unquestioning allegiance from his peon. The peon must have full allegiance to his patron. Otherwise, the patron has every right to demand and extract that allegiance out of them. And frankly, if a patron chooses to kill a peon, even if it is, by our standards, by frankly most countries' standards, outright murder, the patron more or less is not going to be stopped from doing those sorts of things. It's in a sense, it's kind of like being in the South. You can have some masters who are fairly reasonable to their slaves, and then in the South you'll have some others who are not reasonable to their slaves, that are Simon Legrees, as it were. Use the old Uncle Tom Cabin stuff. Example to kind of understand how far this goes and how it can even surprise the sensibilities of some hardened Americans. I'll take this story from, I believe it was about December of 35. It may have been January of 36, but it was in that revolutionary period before Goliad, before the Alamo, after the fall of San Antonio in December 35. It's revolutionary period. There were some Tejanos led by a fellow named Placido Benavides. He is a son-in-law of Martin de Leon, the great impresario from Victoria. Well, Placido Benavides and some of his vaqueros, some of his in-laws, in fact, were riding, and along with them were evidently about 20 or so Anglos, one of which was James Bowie. And they were riding through the brush country outside of Victoria. I believe it was on the road between Victoria and La Bahia Goliad. And they were trying to get intel and reconnaissance about what was the Mexican army outpost up to, what's going on, have you seen anything, have you heard anything, sort of business. And they came upon this peon who was walking down the road. And for whatever reason, Placido Benavides stopped, and they stopped this peon who was walking. The rest of the Benavides and his men, Bowie and his men, were all on horseback. And Benavides will ask this peon and says, what do you know? What have you seen about the Mexican army? And this peon basically said, I don't know anything. I haven't seen anything. I don't know. Not me. And for whatever reason, Benavides, whatever it was about that man, Benavides said, there's something not right. He's not telling me the truth. And so Benavides orders one of his men to take this peon, put a noose around his neck, and drag him up into a tree. Yes, to potentially lynch the guy. They let him hang there and kick till he started to pass out. And they cut him down, and they threw a bucket of water on him, woke him up, and asked him, what do you know? And the guy said, I don't know anything. I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. They did it again. Brought him down again. Asked him a second time, what do you know? I know nothing. I know nothing. Finally, they took him a third time up into the tree, and they took him to an inch of his life. The man was basically passed out. They brought him down a third time, and they asked him one more time, what do you know? And the guy said, I know. And here's what I've seen, what I've found out. And evidently it was legitimate, and it was good information. The man had been holding out on his patron, on a patron at least. The Spaniards, not Spaniards, say this correctly, the Tejanos found nothing wrong at all with what just happened. That's what happens to peons who lie to their patrons. The Americans, the Americanos in there, the Bowies of the world, Bowie not so much because he knew the Tejanos, but other Anglos in the group were just absolutely outraged, like, how dare you do that to a person? That's inhumane. And that man probably had seen, I'm just going to speculate a little bit, but that man, that Anglo, had probably seen slaves before. Yet it's really to the point where you must understand that a patron and a peon, theirs is a very interesting and relationship in Mexico, just like Bowie and his slaves would be an interesting relationship as well. One other thing to say is that in Mexico in this time period, you're going to have a group of individuals called leperos. Leperos. They are people of the street. They're kind of the forgotten folks in Mexico. And so Mexico is an interesting study of who's doing what and where and how and when. So that's an hour and 8 minutes. I think that's a good enough lecture for today, and we'll call it a day, and I'll see you on Wednesday. So thank you much for watching, and we'll get back together on Wednesday at the normal class time.